What's your thoughts on government cover-ups or covert societies attempting to control humanity? Do you believe in ancient astronauts, intergalactic communication, or extraterrestrial visitations? Ever had an experience with disembodied spirits or the paranormal universe? Are these subjects fact or fiction? Each week, Tony and Eddie explore these unbelievable realities and beyond. Exclusively on Truth Be Told.
Hello and welcome back to another broadcast of Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and with me now, world-renowned psychic, Eddie Connor.
Hi, everybody. 2 words for you, Tony. Money and power. Money and power is what most religious wars are fought over.
That's right, Eddie. And today we are going to have a guest. He's a New York Times best-selling author. Yes, Gerald Posner is in the house, well, actually on the phone. But his latest book, God's Bankers, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican, will shock you, and I guess it's going to probably piss you off just a little bit during this interview.
I have a feeling. Now, quoted by the New York Times about his latest book, they say, and I quote, a deeply reported, fast-paced expose of the money and the cardinals turned financiers at the heart of the Vatican, the world's biggest, most powerful religious institution, from an acclaimed journalist with an exhaustive research technique.
Gerald Posner is one of the most resourceful investigators in journalism today.
And his book, Case Closed, was a New York Times bestseller and a finalist for the 1994 Pulitzer Prize for History. Tony, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and welcome New York Times bestselling author Gerald Posner.
Welcome, Gerald.
Tony, Eddie, great to be with you. And you're right, as close as I can be to be in the house, but pretty close at least by phone.
That's right. And the people loved you, as you can hear. Well,
it was a good welcome.
Well, one thing that I'm very impressed with you is the topics and the subject that you pick. And as we always do, and I explain to our audience that when we have somebody on for the first time, we like to get to know them a little bit more before we get into the topic that we had talked about previously, so meaning the God's bankers. So I want to know, where did you start your investigating? I mean, you must have been a very curious child.
It's actually a very good description. My mother would have agreed with you 1,000%. Curious, always why, wondering, why. And I think that from in high school and then in college, I wasn't very good at sports, but I was pretty good at debate, so I was on the debate club. And one of the things you got to do, which was fantastic, they gave you a topic each year. I remember one year in high school was whether the United States should unilaterally intervene in countries to, change their governments if they weren't friendly to the U.S. And you had to investigate both sides, you had to research both sides, and you had to be prepared to argue both sides. And what it taught me at a pretty young age as a teenager was the idea that research was king, because the more you knew, the better off you were. Knowledge was truly power. We hear that all the time, but it is true. And the other thing was that you got to understand that you had to go into subjects with pretty much a blank slate. We all have our biases and our predispositions about what we think something happens in a subject. If we're looking at a famous murder case or something to do with history, we already have an inclination about what we think. But you have to go into it as a researcher or a journalist or as a historian with a mind to say, I'm going to follow the evidence. Wherever the evidence takes me, that's where I'm going to go. If it's to the opposite of what I think when I start the research, then I'm going to end up there. And if it confirms what my intuition tells me might be the case, that's fantastic. But essentially, the research takes you to the evidence leads you to the story. And that's been pretty much from a kid on what's driven me, no matter what I've been doing.
So it must drive you absolutely insane during election years when you have Democrats and Republicans and Tea Party people and all of this other stuff, and they're all mouthing off at each other, and no one's listening, and 95% of them are not backing up 1 ounce of what they're spewing.
Well, okay, it would normally drive me crazy. It used to. You're absolutely right. At a younger age, but then I started to learn that I was mistaken. What I mean by that, the mistake that I had was that I approached politics as a subject of information. That what I thought Democrats and Republicans and independents were really trying to do was pass along information to the public so that we could then take that information, as I would if I was looking into a subject for an article or a book or whatever, and then we'd weigh what one proposal was versus another, and we'd make a decision. Oh, excuse me, it has nothing to do with that. What, of course, it is sort of the filtering of information, the distortion of information, the packaging of information to make things that are complicated, overly simplified, to sway an electorate by fear or by moving them in terms of what you think their base motivation is. And so once I stopped looking at national, state, and local politics as a truly informative process and view it more as a sales process, that I'm being sold by Madison Avenue, these candidates, and they're very carefully packaged, and they're trying their best to get my vote.
Right.
I now have a much more jaundiced and cynical eye, and my blood pressure no longer gets highly raised when listening to them, for the most part.
That's good information to have, let me tell you. I mean, it's good information to have. I want to take what you just described and start implementing. Yeah, well, if there were a pill, I'm sure the pharmaceutical companies would be $1 richer today.
Right.
So I want to ask you, with God's Bankers, which is the title of your book, and it's a history of money and power at the Vatican, what was the one thing that was absolutely the most jaw-dropping, surprising thing you uncovered that you lost sleep over?
Okay, the one thing more than anything else, more than a banker hanging under a London Bridge by his throat that turns out to be a murder, and more than one of Italy's top financiers who's a partner with the Vatican Bank who ends up poisoned inside his jail cell on the second day he's in prison with cyanide and is deemed a suicide. Those are all pretty shocking. But the most shocking by far was the discoveries in archives in Eastern Europe and in company files from World War II that the Vatican, which established its bank, it's a 2,000-year-old institution. Remember this,
right.
It comes back to the days of Christ, established its bank in the middle of World War II, ended up establishing the bank to do business secretly with the Nazis behind the scenes so that it could be on both sides of the war, depending on who won. If we won, and the U.S. and British, they would have invested in us, which they did, and they hid all their investments in the Nazis. They invested in insurance companies that profited from taking the life insurance policies of Jews who were sent to Auschwitz and never paying it out. Big profits flowed into the bank. And after the war, some of the Nazi gold that was stolen also ends up at the Vatican. That's the most shocking part, is the World War II behavior of the Vatican. And I'm Catholic, by the way. I was raised Catholic. I was an altar boy. I've called on the Pope twice, separate from the book. In the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times, I've done op-eds calling on Pope Francis, who is a reformer, to release the Vatican's sealed World War II Holocaust files so we can know, finally, how much money the Church made in what I call this blood money in World War II, and so far, Pope Francis and the Church have ignored those requests.
So what, because I'm looking at the roster of books that you've written, and very impressive, but how do you choose, and what was it about this subject? I know you're Catholic, but what was it about this subject that brought you to write this book? Was there somebody or a situation that happened, or?
No, that's a great question, because every book has a different reason why. And the first book, by the way, which was back in the 80s, a biography of the Nazi doctor Joseph Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death.
Oh, God.
Some of your people may remember Gregory Peck played him in The Boys from Brazil, and there was the Marathon Man with Dustin Hoffman and Laurence Olivier based on him.
Right.
that started when it seems like another life, but I was a lawyer early on, and I was representing some twins of Auschwitz, the concentration camp where Mengele was the doctor, who'd been experimented on by him in a pro bono lawsuit. The lawsuit failed, but I had all these documents, and I turned it into a biography of Mengele. Oh. When I was down in Argentina doing work on Mengele, I got into these Nazi files in the Argentinian government, and there I came across material that showed that some of the Nazi fugitives who arrived in South America after the war had gotten there with the help of a bishop, a Catholic bishop in Rome, and a Catholic priest, Father Weber and Bishop Udall. And I put in the back of my mind that one day I wanted to go back and write about this. Now, from 1985 until 2005, 20 years, I ended up doing other books. And in 2005, I proposed to Simon & Schuster a book about what I call the rat line, the exodus of Nazi war fugitives to South America and how they may have been helped by the Vatican. That's what the kernel of this book was. And then it goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning of our discussion. You start to do your research, and you go where the facts go, and it turned out not to be a book so much about Nazis and the rat line as it was about money. It's what Eddie said in the beginning, power and money. And it became a book not just about World War II, but a 200-year history of the finances of the Vatican. So that's not what I thought I was going to end up doing, but that's what the book turned out to be.
Well, I don't know, last week, or if you're listening to us on podcast, we interviewed a gentleman, Sanford Holst, who...
Yes, I listened to that.
And which we learned a lot, which I didn't know the Knights Templar actually were protectors of Catholic Church and the Pope until they turned on him. So, and that's where they had to become Freemasons. And so it sounds like the Catholic Church, sorry for the Catholics out there, but from the beginning has had a sinister side to it.
Well, you have to think, and it's interesting, when the Knights of Templar, the one thing that I wanted to sort of say last week, and so I get the wonderful thing of following up on that good interview that you have with this little tidbit.
Right.
Remember, just a second ago I was saying how I was asking the Pope to release the World War II files. The Vatican took nearly 700 years to release the heresy trials of the Knights of Templar. They released them in 2008. So the Vatican can take a long time in finally revealing what the truth is. It's one of the benefits about being an old institution. But when you say sinister, it's really interesting, because what it comes down to is once you get into the story here, we have to remember it's not just the religion, the world's second biggest religion now after Islam, but it's a country. It's the only religion that has its own country. This little postage stamp piece of property that's like 7 city blocks in size has a flag at the United Nations, and that gives it a sovereign power. That's why it can have its own bank and run it in the dark. That's why it has to worry about financing of terrorism laws and money laundering and all of that. And when you're dealing with the idea of a sovereign entity that considers itself, used to be a kingdom, they used to be Pope kings, now they have a much smaller bit of property, but that's where the fighting comes inside for these bits of power, for status, for honor, for prestige. And since you've taken out the sexual quotient, putting aside, the whole issue of the pedophile lawsuits in the U.S. from pedophile priests, but you have celibate men who are sworn at least to celibacy, living and working with each other, running a country and running the world's biggest religion with billions of dollars at stake. No wonder occasionally, even if 80 or 85% of them do the right thing, you're going to have some who are given to human frailty, and that's where the problems come in.
Wow. My mouth is just
and my head is spinning. His mouth is on the floor. His jaw's on the floor. My head's spinning in circles. I'm just flabbergasted. I truly
well, I'm glad to hear that. That's always good. I'm always glad to hear when two people like you who, have a lot of interviews, you're involved in all types of things. I see how successful you are. When I hear one of you say flabbergasted, that's always a good word, because, that's... I get so far into the research that I don't realize sometimes what's flabbergasting or not. So it's always good to hear that from an outside perspective.
Well, and do you ever have, because of the nature of what you're doing, do you ever find that, or have people follow you on social networks and like go, "You're lying, I can't believe it"? Do you get some of those like nutbags?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one of the, so in my view, one of the great things about the internet and social media and everything else is that it's the democratization of an opinion. So everybody can have an equal opinion, and if it's in 140 characters on Twitter, it really doesn't matter if you're Beyonce or President Obama, but the person who has just lost a job and is scrounging by on $12,000 a year has just as strong an opinion in 140 characters. Because it's anonymous, they tend to sometimes say things that they would never say in any other format. And I definitely, I mean, on the book on God's Bankers, I had people who are strict, hardline, devout Catholics who were infuriated because they considered it anti-Catholic. And I tell them all the time, and they get very exercised about it and very, very angry and very nasty sometimes, but it's not an anti-Catholic book. It is just a history. And if somebody does, for instance, my wife is British. If I did a history of the British royal family, I'm sorry, I would not be able to skip over the part where Henry VIII cuts off the heads of his 8 wives.
Right.
Yeah.
If I'm doing a history of Germany, I can't skip over the Holocaust. So there are a lot of good things in this history, but at the same time, there are also a lot of dark chapters and low points. That's the nature of a history. You get it all. You get good things and warts. And I sort of give it to you very, very straight. People who love the institution that I write about, therefore take it out on me. When I wrote a book in 2005 on Saudi Arabia, Tricia, my wife, and I were officially banned from entering Saudi Arabia.
Wow.
They didn't like the book. So, that's the fallout of these types of research projects.
Well, I have to say, I wouldn't be fearful of the people on social media. I mean, because even Eddie and I get, comments to us, that we're, crazy and whatever reasons, but for me it's the institution itself, because you're dealing and even telling the truthful history about anything. The actual institution could not like it. and
yes.
And have you been threatened from the actual institution itself?
No, never from the institution, which is interesting. And here's my feeling about that. So, Tony and Eddie, my view is that the institution does one of two things. It can make your life very difficult. It could try to sue you. It can try to
set you up.
All these things. True. But what they do at the Vatican, which is very interesting, is they have the long view. And by that, I mean this. This is an institution that the Rome was sacked by the Huns. They survived it. Napoleon took Rome and took the Pope back to France as a prisoner and destroyed a lot of the secret archives. They survived it. Hitler came into power and ravaged World War II. They survived it. So their view is, you know what? We are a 2,000-year-old institution. We got over the Huns and Napoleon and Hitler. We can get by one bad book by this writer in America who's talking about the finances of the Vatican, and their way of dealing with it is to totally ignore it. They won't answer it. They don't talk about it. They don't respond to anything. The same way they gave me a stiff arm when I tried to get in and see documents there is their way of dealing with it. So if the Vatican doesn't like it, look, if they're very good at publicity, the Pope is going to Cuba, and then he's going to Mexico. You will get a picture of him, as you saw today, on his plane wearing a sombrero. They make sure photo opportunities are very carefully controlled.
Right.
When he goes to the border, and he's going to be at the Mexican border and say a cross-border mass, he met with the head of the Orthodox faith today in Havana. That's all going to be choreographed. But if they don't want to deal with it, they are absolutely silent. So that's their way of doing it. And I always think that if you're going to have a real, this is a business of writing investigative books and investigative histories that, you're right, you could always have difficulty with somebody or dangers with somebody. I still am not, I ran around with heroin dealers and DEA agents to do a book on the heroin business back in the 1980s. I probably today would not do that. The risk would be a little too high. But, I'm still fairly open-minded and willing to take on just about anything, the risk notwithstanding.
Well, I find that it's amazing and integrous of you that I would imagine maybe once or twice when you were doing the research on this specific book about God's Bankers, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican, did you in the back of your mind think maybe I should just sort of leave this section out just in case?
Or did you?
Well, It's interesting. So my feeling is that on the whole, there are things as a writer of these types of books, and you both know you have the book there.
Right.
So I have 200 pages of endnotes at the end about sources, where I got things, documents, because one of the things you're always afraid of as a reporter is that the Vatican or whoever you're writing about will come back and say, oh, that's all just a bunch of malarkey.
Right.
That's all false. It's just secondhand rumors. So you want to be able to tell them where you got it from so that they can't take any issue with that. But in addition, there are things you leave out, not because you decide that it's too incendiary or too explosive. If I had that, I would put it in. That's my nature. Mm-hmm. But because you either can't get a second confirmation of it, it looks tantalizing, a source has told you, you believe the source to be credible, but you need an extra bit of confirmation before you can actually put it in and run with it. So things that you can't verify from two sources, I leave out, even if it's a tantalizing story. And those are just the nature of it. There are also things that I looked into that I thought would be productive areas. Some of them I got about the mafia money laundering through the Vatican Bank in the 70s and 80s. And I thought there was another big story around the year 2000 dealing with a terror organization, but I was never able to pin that story down, and as a result, it just didn't make the book. So that's what happens. You leave things out only because they fall short of your standards for what you view as being credible, but never because you think, oh my God, that's gonna get me in hot water.
Well, how do you feel about the U.S. history books taking and picking and choosing what they claim to be the correct history, as opposed to putting it all in there? And not by all of it, I don't mean every last ounce of it, but the pertinent things, meaning to tell the truth. Does that drive you a little nutty too? Or
Eddie, you're right. That really does drive me nutty, because that goes back to what we were talking about before.
Yep.
When I said that, like, Catholics say, oh, this is an anti-Catholic book, and I say, no, it's just a history. So if I gave this book to the Vatican and said, by the way, will you re-edit this book to issue? They would edit out all the parts that were the low points, and you would get a book that just was like the Dream Girls version of the story.
Don't make me break into song.
That's right. No, that's right. It could be so my view is you can't be selective, because what one person thinks is important isn't what another person thinks is important. You can't cover it all, agreed, but boy, you've pretty much got to give a glimpse of just about all of the highlights, and not try to say we can leave this section out because it's not important. I'm not a fan of that.
I'm not either, because we learn from our pitfalls, we learn from our mistakes, we learn from the things where we effed up all over the place, and if we keep leaving that kind of stuff out of the history books, we still keep making the same mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's so interesting you say that, because you are singing to the choir here on this, because what I believe is that if you take God's Bankers, all of the chapters up to the last two chapters, that book serves as a template for the current Pope, Pope Francis, or any future Pope. Read that book, and you will know what you need to do in the Catholic Church to reform the finances. It's there. You need some transparency. You need to open up the organizations. You need to stop these secret accounts that nobody else can look at, that they can bring in suitcases of cash, and they do, from the mafia and from wealthy Italians. You've got to stop these black transfers, as they're called, to offshore accounts in the Bahamas and the Caymans and Singapore. You've got to institute some laws against money laundering with real teeth. So if you look at the past, you actually understand what you can do to correct it. You're absolutely right. You learn from history, and you can go forward as a reformer, but you're not going to do that if you just ignore what the past was.
Well, that said, with the current Pope, Francis, he seemed to be completely different than quite a few of the past popes.
Right.
Or his PR machine was.
Or his PR machine. But do you think behind the scenes, I mean, how are the people behind the scenes, do you think, that they're looking at this Pope? Is he an actual threat, or is he just kind of a, one of these puppets that they said we just need to kind of change our like a PR stunt?
Yeah.
Okay. So normally, as you can tell, I'm fairly opinionated based upon my research. I normally give you a definite yes or no, but the part here, the answer is really a bit of both. And what I mean by that's the following. he is definitely different than his predecessors, and he sounds very different. He's a populist, so he's very likable, and he says all the right things. He's a bit like of a Rorschach test, those psychology ink blot tests, when you look at an ink blot and everybody sees something different.
Right.
So everybody who looks at this Pope hears what he says, and they say, "Oh yeah, he's for me." They believe that he's going to open up the church for loosening rules on abortion, for same-sex marriage, that he'll liberalize it when it comes to contraception. But if you look at what he's done, he has been a reformer on the finances. He's put some good, independent, non-clerical people in the Vatican Bank, and I believe that if he has his way in the next 3 to 5 years, he could correct a lot of the excesses there. But in terms of doctrine, although he's given lip service to being a more open, more liberal church, none of the doctrine under him has changed. And I think that in that way, he has stayed a true old liner in terms of approaching faith and doctrine, at the same time that he appears to be a real reformer. That reformer hat is worn with a bit of a caveat, if that makes sense. It's not all PR, but it's not as big a reformer hat as it looks.
To me, it seemed too good to be true, because to have somebody like, what was the one before? I already forgot his name.
Oh, Benedict,
that was so actually, and I hate to say stereotype, but very German. But
right.
But to go to Pope Francis, it was like this complete night and day, too good to be true type of thing. And I didn't know the people behind him, because like the President of the United States, just because he's the president doesn't mean he always has the power. There's a lot of people behind the Pope that have a lot of power. So I didn't know how they look at the Pope, if you even knew that.
Yeah, well, they were initially extremely distrusting of him. So in the beginning, they thought all of these expressions that he had about, who am I to judge?
Right.
Let's have an open church and things like this. They thought, oh my God, this guy's a revolutionary. He's going to upend the entire church. And so there was a tremendous amount of resistance inside what I call the Curia, which is sort of the bureaucracy of the Vatican. 800 to 900 priests, monsignors, bishops, and cardinals who run the government of the church. And although the Pope can change, that bureaucracy stays pretty much the same. It passes on to a new group of chosen priests and that. And so whereas we get a new president, so Barack Obama comes in after George Bush, he brings in a whole series of new advisors, and Democratic operatives start to populate everything in the Justice Department. We get Supreme Court appointments. A Republican comes in, they start to do the same thing. But a new Pope comes in. That Pope brings in 3 to 4 advisors with him. That's it. And the government, the bureaucracy, the Curia stays the same. So it would be as if when Barack Obama took office, he gets just a couple of advisors, and the rest of the government stays a Bush administration. So it's a very odd situation in the Vatican, where you get the Pope elected. He is supposedly the vicar of Christ on earth. He represents Christ for true Catholics. And then the bureaucracy underneath is all about surviving and holding on to its power. 90% of it's Italian, and I'm half Italian, so I can say this as a result of having done this book. Half of the problems of the Vatican are a result of the fact that it's in Italy. It's chaotic, it's disorganized, it's got its own levels of corruption. Some of the cardinals who have brothers on the other side who are working with the mob, it's a mess. So the Italian side is part of the problem, but it's also the entire institution underneath the Pope.
Wow. So,
oh my God.
Yeah, no.
Just like
we're gonna have to take just a minute break, because we're gonna take a break for our sponsor, and we have so much more to talk about when we get back from this break. Everybody, we're listening to Gerald Posner, his book God's Bankers: A History of Money and Power at the Vatican. This is such a fascinating topic. The Catholic Church has been here since the beginning of Christianity. And this is one of these topics that not a lot of people want to talk about, but we do right here at Truth Be Told.
Absolutely. And when we come back, we're going to ask you about some of the mega churches and how you can blow our mind with some of the politics behind that and politics.
So,
absolutely.
All right. So don't go anywhere. Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Eddie Connor.
We'll be right back.
Agri-terrorism in the USA? Is it possible? Makes you wonder, could it be possible for our food to be poisoned? How will the public know which foods have been contaminated with toxins before it's too late? Heaven's Harvest wants to help you become independent of these rare but possible scenarios. Protect your future and become self-reliant with heirloom seeds. Grow your own garden. From urban to rural living, Heaven's Harvest seeds are the answer to any type of scenario. Go to truthbetoldseeds.com and order your bucket today. Every type of vegetable you could imagine. Go to truthbetoldseeds.com or call 1-800-516-4773. When you go to truthbetoldseeds.com and purchase your bucket, you will get 5% off the original price. So order today at truthbetoldseeds.com.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm Eddie Connor, and I'm here with Tony Sweet. Now is the time. Order your kit right now and have it shipped directly to you in a gorgeous little bucket, because it's about peace of mind. It's about food security, and you can order your seeds now at truthbetoldseeds.com. That's truthbetoldseeds.com.
All right, we're back. We're back with New York Times best-selling author Gerald Posner, and he is here to talk about his latest book that was just released a few weeks ago, or I think last week maybe, God's Bankers, History of Money and Power at the Vatican. And this is a fascinating topic, and I hope you guys are enjoying it. And again, we would love to have you, give us some comments on what you think on any of our pages, on our YouTube channel or our iHeartRadio.
This book should have, this book should have started out with WTF OMG. It is. So let me ask you, Gerald, where do you think the mega churches in North America get their model?
Well, I think that the mega churches in North America have taken the Catholic model of the cathedral, like in New York City, you have St. Patrick's and St. Mary's in San Francisco. So you have one dominant mega church that, although you have other satellites around it, that's the church where the high services are done. That's the church where the cardinal goes to. That's the church for the center of all of the major activities. And very, very clever and smart, what I call prosperity theology, Christian preachers have decided that mega churches, just a single one, and they're based in it, can appeal in an electronic and 21st century manner to a lot of people, 10, 15,000 inside the church and tens of thousands outside, and they're selling prosperity. And it's a very seductive package of religion and success, and they've been wildly successful.
Doesn't it shock you that a handful, and I mean a small microscopic handful, of these people are hugely successful under the umbrella of preaching prosperity consciousness, and the very people that are making them rich are living payday to payday, desperately wanting to tap into that frequency?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, Eddie and Tony, there's no question in prosperity theology in these big Christian megachurches that, and it's not just Tammy Faye and Jim Baker, but it's across the board. Not just those egregious examples, but in many instances, not only do the preachers in the top of the faith live extravagant lifestyles, but that's used as a way to attract people who are contributing to say, you can have this if you believe and follow the faith. And you're right, many of the people who are contributing don't have any money. Remember, the Catholic Church, which doesn't use the prosperity theology idea, its priests take a vow of poverty, but the church itself doesn't take a vow of poverty. That's what my book's about. The church is all about money, making money, investing in items, having to pay 2/3 of $1 billion at one point in the 90s because they were involved in frauds with banks across Europe. So they may take a vow of poverty at the priest stage, but the Pope lives in one of the grandest places in all the world, inside St. Peter's. There's an art collection there that's priceless, and the people who are giving $1 or sometimes 20 centavos or that are people across the third world, in Mexico, in the fastest growing places, in the Philippines, in Korea, where they don't have money to make ends meet at the end of the week, but they're contributing to the church. And meanwhile, the church itself is living in a lifestyle that you have to wonder, not individually, I don't mean the priests themselves, but the church as an institution is doing things with that money. When you read this book, you think to yourself, why are these people who barely can make ends meet, who have trouble feeding their family, they so believe in this process of God, it's almost as if they're somehow being snookered into parting with their money into it, and it can be quite infuriating.
It is infuriating. When did politics and religion start getting in bed the worst in this country, in your opinion? When did you, knowing what you know so much more than a lot of our audience does, it, or that Tony and I know. I'm curious as to when you started seeing, Gerald, religion jumping in bed with politics and then pushing their agenda under the radar.
Yeah, I think you've certainly seen it in really what I call this period from Ronald Reagan and on more than anything else. I mean, it's so interesting to think here we are, a pluralistic society. One of the things that used to aggravate the Vatican when America was first forming was the idea they hated in the Vatican that we had a constitution that called for separation of religion and government.
Yep.
Because to them, the whole idea of that was terrible. They wanted a religion that was a government that was also religious. That's what they had, and they wanted European governments that were Catholic governments. The U.S. threatened that by saying we would be pluralistic. But here we are, in the last 30, 40 years, absolutely riven by religion and politics, not only just in terms of national politics and religion and issues, whether it's about abortion issues or whether it's about contraception or whether it's about same-sex marriage, but in addition, the Catholic Church, which owns more property in the United States as a private religion than any other, owns more property, private property in New York City than anybody else except for the city of New York,
What?
the government. Yes, it's the second largest property owner in New York City, and it's tax-free. Now, remember, they are tax-free because they are not supposed to get involved in politics. But
Right.
you know and I know, and I talk about this in the book, they are constantly involved in politics.
Mm-hmm.
They are working behind the scenes to make sure that bills pass that are favorable, that are against abortion. They make efforts to limit questions and debates about contraception, and it's Catholic charities and Catholic hospitals at the forefront often of challenging parts of Obamacare. So it's remarkable to me that the Catholic religion in particular has, as an organized effort, worked very, very hard to make sure it has a political influence. At the same time, it walks a fine line so it doesn't lose its tax exemption, and they've managed to do it successfully.
When do you think, what do you think will happen in my little dream world here? This is my ever after bubble. When churches have to pay taxes, and maybe it's a different level of taxes than everybody else, but if they choose to keep putting themselves in a position to be political in their own right, they should effing have to pay taxes.
Well, it absolutely is. It's the question that nobody wants to ask in politics because I guess they consider it the third rail of politics. They say Social Security is the third rail of politics, but if they suggest that, they know that at every pulpit in America, they will unite overnight.
Yeah.
Every imam and rabbi and priest
Yeah.
and Christian preacher will be on the same side of the issue, arguing against it. One of the great victories won by Scientology when it was claiming to be a religion
right.
was
I
the
remember
fight
that.
against the IRS,
Yep.
right, for tax exemption status. And, so you're talking tens of millions of dollars a year in difference. In Rome, the Catholic Church, for instance, the Vatican, I talk about this a little in the book, they own large commercial property. They're also the largest landowner in Rome other than the Italian government. Some of the property they own includes a few years ago they were embarrassed because it turned out that one of the buildings they own has the largest gay bathhouse in Rome, and they said, "Oh, we didn't know that was renting the space on the ground floor."
Sure,
even though
they
one
did.
of the cardinals was living in the same building, which has apartments up above. So we'll leave that aside.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I know.
but
With a fire pole that went straight down to the
Yeah,
bathhouse.
I forgot to investigate the fire pole. I knew I missed something on it. But they own property in prime shopping district commercial property, which they don't pay tax on. But for instance, in one instance, Valentino, the great fashion designer,
Yeah.
his property in Milan, he was paying something like the equivalent of 150 euros a month. It's like $160, $170 for rent for a property that should have been something like $15,000. That's because he was friends with the cardinal who was then Secretary of State, and they gave him a sweetheart deal.
Wow.
So my feeling on this is, if you're going to own commercial property, if you're going to own property that you do special favors for friends because you like them and everything else, you can do everything you want, but you should pay some taxes back to society on that as well.
Not only that, but I would love to see a graft with the evidence of what they do for people that literally are living, bowl of soup to bowl of soup versus people that are higher up that they're doing favors for that will never need the money to start with. I would love to see the contrast between those two.
Okay, so here's one of the things that's interesting about it. So Catholic charities, and I use this that means everything from church-sponsored charities to these private charity groups, and that Catholic Charities claims to be, and they might be, the largest private charity group in the world. So they do a lot of good in what I call, they do good in a bundle of countries, but at the same time, the church does a whole bunch of things that makes you like you said, your jaw just opened and hit the desk when you read about it. So It's a bit of yin and yang. But in addition, there's one other little caveat. There are people that I talked to in India and other third world countries that said Catholic charities do a lot of good in this country, but they use the charities as a basis to push their own agenda in two ways. First, Mother Teresa, great, wonderful, fantastic woman, but in where she took care of young, unwed mothers in India, which was one of the things she did, fantastic work that nobody else was doing, they also very, very strongly pushed the idea that there would be no abortions ever. You never were going to have that. It was against the faith, so that was clear. And they pushed the idea at the same time that contraception was against human nature. So Catholic doctrine gets pushed together with the charity, and some people believe that those charities are an outlet for eventually trying to convert people from other faiths. So it comes with a little bit of extra baggage occasionally.
Wow. Who do you think's meaner, a nun, a priest, or a pope?
Well, I can answer that without any equivocation because I had nuns for grammar school and I had priests, Jesuits for high school, and there's no doubt the nuns were meaner.
That's funny.
Everybody answers that question the same.
That is hilarious.
Now maybe, it is, Eddie and Tony, maybe it's because the nuns get us when we're younger, so we're more in awe and fear of them.
Yeah,
but when you are a 7 or 8 year old and you're talking in class to somebody else, and the nun used to come up and grab your ear and pull it, I'll tell you, your heart was pounding.
Wow.
One thing I noticed, and I think I'm very impressed with, is how you really do your research and put things together.
Remarkable.
And this is a great history book, but it's also a great murder mystery because we haven't really talked about. And we have about 7 more minutes before we have to go off the air. But there's a lot of not only corruption money wise, but a lot of people have been murdered. Through challenging or the Catholic Church to maybe taking money from the church. So when you were doing your research, where is this coming from? Because the religion itself is love and
right.
teaching the God's work, but then there's another side of it that they would go out of their way to eliminate someone.
Well, that's the schizophrenic aspect of this story is exactly what you just said. You have the religious side, which is really about ministering to the poor and the good, and
right.
for most part, the men who do that, and there are nuns as well, but when they're priests, they're men, and the
right.
Vatican, the people running the system are all men. They really do try to do that well. But the other schizophrenic part of it is that it's this government, and that it operates as a government, and that it has a lot of money, and that there's no transparency and no accountability. And so that's why the book opens up with a body of an Italian banker dangling underneath the London Bridge. He's hanging there by his neck from a rope, and the British look into it. This is in 1982. It opens up the book, and they conclude that it was suicide. Well, he would have had to climb up 32 stairs backwards, essentially do a somersault, tie a rope around his neck at the same time he was putting 7 pounds of rocks in his pockets and jumped off the side, even though he suffered from vertigo. That aside, it took about 25 years to determine that it was in fact murder. He was a partner with the Vatican Bank. He was deep into fraud. The Vatican Bank was found to be into fraud. I go into that story in detail, and you're left with all. And they never tried anyone from his murder until 2005, 2006. They put 5 people finally on the stand in Italy, including some mafia guys. They were all acquitted. Nobody's ever gone to jail. And one major financier, sort of like what you would call not the Donald Trump, because he wasn't like that, but maybe a very successful financier who was also a partner with the Vatican, ended up going to jail in the 80s, and I tell his story, and he was tied into the mafia in the end. His whole empire came crashing down. He was the biggest bankruptcy in American history at the time with Franklin National, U.S. Bank. They put him, Tony and Fred, you're going to love this, they put him, Eddie, into a special wing of a newly constructed prison because they were so afraid that somebody was going to try to get to him because he knew so much about the Vatican Bank. They had video cameras on him. They had guards around the clock 24 hours a day in 3 shifts. They made his food in a special section of the prison and brought it to him in sealed containers. The second day he was in, he opens up his food, takes a sip of coffee, grabs at his throat, and goes, and says in Italian, "I'm poisoned." In fact, he was killed by cyanide, and the Italians investigated and say, "Oh, suicide." And then finally, there's the mystery of whether one pope, John Paul I, in the 1970s, in 1978, was in fact murdered after 33 days because he was going to clean house at the Vatican Bank, and so there's a mystery hanging over that. So there is a story of murder and intrigue at the periphery of this tale.
And here's my last question. Eddie may have one more, but Rome, it survived thousands of years being an empire, and the Catholic Church is an empire, and they've been around for 2,000 years. Do you think that it's too big to fail?
Yes. Yeah, I do think it's too big to fail. It's too big to fail in terms of 1.3 billion people, and the reason the whole history for the Catholic Church changed in 1870 because that's when it lost its empire. Italy was united again. The Catholics had 15,000 square miles called the Papal States. They lost that, and they no longer were a country. And then it was Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was the fascist dictator of Italy. Yeah. He's the one who struck a deal with them and gave them back their sovereign status, made them a country, even though they were only Vatican City. As a result of that, today they're both a country and they are this world religion. So I think they qualify with J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs and Bank of America too big to fail.
Well, I look at them actually kind of like
the same thing.
The same thing.
I have a super off the wall question, and we literally have 2 minutes left. I'm curious. You're such an investigative journalist and all of this wonderful stuff. You're a phenomenal writer. You go to great painstaking efforts to get what you get. Just in a sentence or two, Native Americans, are you remotely interested in any of the stuff that happened with the Native American community in North America specifically?
Yeah, I am. I've never done any writing on it. I've never had it as a subject to look at either for magazine articles or for a book, but I absolutely would be interested because it's one of those subjects that I could go into pretty much with an opinion to say, boy, I will follow the information to tell the story. It could be very, very good. I will tell you that I'm just reached an agreement with my publisher for my next book, and so we'll have to wait for one more book. My next book's going to be about Big Pharma.
Oh, right. That's going to be amazing. Well, I'm going to go ahead.
I figure I might as well get in real hot water.
Right.
The Vatican didn't get me enough hot water. I might as well get in hot water with Big Pharma.
Well, we're going to go ahead and put the invitation out. We have to have you back because we have so many other of your books to talk about. We love subjects here especially most of the stuff that you've researched and written about. Yeah, that we love truth be told. We want people to learn about the truth and go out and try to make a difference within themselves. But please, people, go out and pick up this book. It's God's Bankers, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican. And you can pick it up on Amazon. You can go to his website, and that's Posner, it's POSNER.com. And please, go ahead and go check out. He has tons of other books to read. I'll tell you.
One of the books we want you to come back and talk about is Killing the Dream, the James Earl Ray and assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. That's near and dear to my heart.
I would love to. It happens to be, by the way, out of 12 books that I've done, one of if you said to me the top 2 books, 3 books, that's right near the top for me. In terms of doing the research, that story and everything else, I've never had a more intensive and interesting time, and there are so many little mysteries and twists and turns and tough little areas, and little mysteries still outstanding. Yeah, I love that book.
Wow. Well, it's been an honor, and thank you so much for being here.
Gerald, we appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Eddie.
You got it. And we'll talk to you soon.
See you.
Okay.
Bye-bye. All right, guys, that was Gerald Posner, and please go out and pick up his books. And Eddie, that was a joy. That was fun.
Mine is blown.
Yes. So, well, if you watched this halfway through, if you like what you saw and want to watch it again, go to our YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and then type in Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. You can find us there. Go to iHeartRadio and listen to the podcast, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, all the places. And please like us, spread the word, and let us know what you think, and tell us other guests that you'd like to have on the show.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's our time, so it is time to say goodbye to all of our company. So you've listened to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm Tony Sweet.
I'm Eddie Connor.
We're out of here. Take care, guys.
Bye, y'all.